wherever you are. We all want that. We all need that.
I'm from Denmark, and we are hearing a lot in Denmark at the moment that our future should be built on the knowledge of our people. So you have talked a lot about emerging markets, emerging countries, but how do you see the role of Western countries in this new era in terms of knowledge or role in terms of?
I think Western countries are going to have there's huge potential there too, but I think the market, the addressable market, the biggest part of the market will be in this part of the world. So I think the thing you have to realize is if you want to do well, you have to go to where the market is, and that market, the scale of it will be more in this part of the world. That said, I think it's going to be very easy for a Danish company, like think about Lego. I mean, Lego's an amazing organization, and it's product, but I actually think a lot of it's around knowledge. If you think about the design, the innovation that goes on, but what they've been able to do is figure out how to globalize that. And I think one of the most important things is thinking about how you take the ideas you have, and think about how you can digitize that or get it to different parts of the world. So I think that Singapore. Think about Singapore. I'm very bullish on Singapore because it's a knowledge economy and it understands where its markets are going to be. It doesn't try and focus on its market share in Singapore. It thinks about how can I attract parts of businesses from around the world to be based out of here to do things in that part of the world. The same with the Dutch. So I think that there's what I think Europe has and what the US has, you have a higher proportion of the population that's higher educated, and that's going to be an advantage for a while, not forever. It's changing, but that ability to be able to educate and train people and then figure out ways to globalize it will work. So I think there's lots of opportunities, but you have to remember that a lot of your markets are going to be in this part of the world.
So we will see, as you said, nowadays Africa is another emerging market. So, but it's unstable, and the population, the disaster, or many things. So one day, if Africa dominates in the economic, how can we manage Africa? Not like nowadays. Thank you.
This comes back a bit to the question here on where the markets are, and I think it's very important as a company to have a long-term view, a 10 to 15-year view about where you think your market's going to be. And I would argue for many companies that will be Africa. And you can't decide in 10 to 15 years to all of a sudden hire a bunch of people from Africa or build a bit. It takes time to develop people. So one of the things I'd be doing is if I look at a company and I'd say, what % of your top 100 are Africans? And if it's 0, that's probably not very good, because you need to have people. I used to say that about China. What percentage of the top 100 are Chinese? And if they're not, you got a problem, right? And I would actually, a lot of the Scandinavian countries moved faster on that, Germans, than many of the other parts of the world. So you got to think about your talent pool. It's your talent pool, where you have your offices or your headquarters, and how you move that. One organization I admire a lot in terms of globalizing is actually Lenovo. Lenovo is one of the most global organizations. I don't actually believe they have a headquarters. It's not one, it isn't Beijing as a head. They have multiple headquarters or centers of expertise around the world. So I think the idea of having one headquarters is old school. You need to have multiple ones. Even in McKinsey, I actually don't even know where the headquarters of McKinsey are. It doesn't matter. Because you have centers of excellence in different parts of the world, and then people can use technology to link up. But I would be designing your capabilities and organization for 10 to 15 years from now, because that's going to come very quickly, and if you're not there, you won't be relevant. Well, I think it's a good point, is that we're all much more interconnected. So first of all, I would say that, you know, there's no single business person, even if you're a very domestically focused business person, that doesn't worry or think about what China's growth is going to be or not, because it affects it's one of the biggest drivers of global GDP growth, right? So we're all interconnected on that front, no matter what. And so I think that's a view we all have to have a global view that way in where it is. And by the way, I think it's in all of our interest for China to grow stably and strongly wherever you are. We all want that. We all need that as we move things forward.
Professor, this way, or here.
Sorry, I've got you. I'm blind, so I can't see anything.
How do you analyze what President Xi Jinping calls the new normal, and its implication for the world and for China itself?
Yeah, well, that's a pretty deep question, because I think there's a lot of elements to at least my understanding of what the new normal is. But I think one obvious one, if I just might get it, is there is no way that an economy that continues to get larger and larger can grow at the same GDP growth rate it was when it was a 20th the size. I mean, the mathematics don't work. So the idea that that 7% is high, I think we should get used to. I wouldn't be actually worried if the Chinese GDP growth rate went to 5%. We have to be worried about the job creation and so forth. But this economy is getting so large that you have to just expect. We can't get frightened when it's not 10% or 7.4%. So I think that's part of the new normal. I think the other element of a new normal is it's a transition economy. We're moving from a very investment-driven, manufacturing-based economy to a service-based economy. And very, very few economies in the world have made a very nice transformation. There's usually been a crisis. And I'm hoping that China, luckily, people study like hell crises that have gone on and what's happened before. And so I think there's a lot of learning that's going on, but we shouldn't not expect to have volatility. That's going to be normal in an economy of this size that's doing it's sort of like an elephant that we're teaching to do ballet. I mean, sometimes it's hard to keep the balance as you move through it. But I know the outcome. I feel very confident about where it goes. So those are some of the elements, I think, that are going to make it a little more volatile, and we just need to be calm and more long-term about it. That's sort of how I feel, and not get, even the markets, it's amazing what's happening with the stock markets. I actually don't worry too much about that, because I look at that as more of a casino. There's not a lot of institutional investors that are in those markets, so it's never really had a strong relationship. I'm not saying I worry about the 90 million people that have got stocks and so forth, but it isn't like it is in the United States. If you had that gyration going on there, that would have a more significant impact. I think that's part of a financial deepening. So again, I may be being too optimistic, but I actually do, having lived through different financial crises in Asia in 1997 and others, I think I feel very confident about the economic capability of what's happening, but we just have to realize there'll be more volatility in it, and we have to be very careful about not overreacting to it. Yeah. First of all, I don't think you can learn about leadership by people lecturing you about it or reading about it. That's the first point. Second is, soft skills and hard skills have to be taught together. You can't just have a program on leadership and then have a program on hard skills. I think it's better to do it together. So let me pick one of them. You're going to learn about restructuring. You're going to hear from executives that have done restructuring. And what they're going to talk about is they're going to probably spend 20% of their time talking about what you do, how you cut costs, how you fix the balance sheet, how you set a new direction. But you're going to find 80% of it being on how you actually did it, which is around the leadership. And I'll give you an example, just a bit of a preview. One of the biggest challenges that leaders face when you have this much change is how to change people's mindsets, right? And that's, for most CEOs, that's the biggest, getting the answer is easy. It's how do you convince people that they need to change? So I'll give you an example. Walmart, we talked about this before, very successful company, very successful. So when Doug McMillon, who's now the CEO, is there, when you talk to him about retailing, he'll say, we are literally one of the best in the world at figuring out where to put our stores, how to run a supply chain, how to do merchandising, how to price, all those hard skills. But then you find out that 8% of our products are now being sold on the internet, and 50% of our products are being looked at on the internet before people come in. So we're having to become a technology company, but we're very successful. So how do you get 1 million employees who think they're proud of being Walmart, we're a great company, but they're being attacked? And and you tell them the sky's falling, they're gonna go, this guy's a crazy, I mean, what are you talking about? We're number one. So what you'll hear him talk about is, how do I convince 1 million people that they have to change? And that's leadership, and that's what you're gonna hear. So yes, he may be talking about retailing, but 80% of it's on how you actually make it happen. And that's exactly why we have a McKinsey person and we have an executive, so the two together talk about it. And I don't think it makes sense for someone to just come in and talk about leadership, because it's interesting, but unless it's put in the context of the business and the context of what's happening, doesn't mean anything. So that's the attempt. You have to be the judge as to whether we are successful in it, but that's why we marry hard and soft together. We have an active executive and a McKinsey advisor together for hopefully precisely that reason. So it's a good question.
That when you're talking about leadership, it seems that you are more focused on the economic world because you are CEO of the real company. But some say that when you are running the government or when you are running the organization, that it is like that you're running the company. So my question is that when we're talking about the head of the government, when we're talking about their leaderships, any difference between those in the those who are really running the government, and what is the core composition of leadership when it comes to the real political world? Thank you.
I mentioned in that wheel that I talked about, you'll see one thing here is called being a tri-sector athlete, and which basically means I think that the most successful leader in the next 10 to 15 years will be a tri-sector athlete, which means they're good at 3 things. They know how a private company works, they know how a public sector works, and they know how the social sector works. And if you want to be a very good government leader, you need to be tri-sector. You need to understand how the private world works and the NGO world works. And if you want to be a successful NGO leader, the Gates Foundation, you need to understand how business works and government. So first thing is, there are differences, but we actually need to have all together. That's the first point I want to make. The second, and the reason why I think it's important for business people to understand more about what government leaders do, is the complexity of the job of a government leader is more than the complexity of a business person. In a business, typically, you're there to maximize the long-term profitability of the company, and there are measures, and they're measures that everyone can align around. There's no debate about return on equity or shareholder value collect. These are standard rules. If you are working in the Ministry of Justice, or you're working for the police, there isn't one number like shareholder value creation. It's the amount of crime that's going on. It's how stable a particular place is. There's a whole range of different measures, and there's a whole range more of stakeholders. You can't, and I've seen that with some of the SOE leaders in China are some of the most high-performing leaders in the world because they have to manage multiple stakeholders. They cannot just focus on, we're going to make a lot of money and we're going to lay everyone off, and that's how we have to do it. They have a responsibility for the employment of those people. That's a more complex challenge to be able to deal with. And so governments have some different, broader, complex challenges. But that said, there's many things that government leaders can learn from business. One is the agility. I think governments are slower to adapt in terms of the way the market, the world is moving, what consumers want, because they don't really have competition, right? They don't, it's hard to actually change unless you have a threat, if you know what I mean. And the threats that governments have are not ones we want to deal with, right? So I'm talking about how do you get people to feel that? And one example I'm going to give you, Uber. I would not underestimate the impact that Uber is going to have on citizens and therefore governments around the world. When the basic citizen can pick up their phone, let's say in California, wherever in the world, London, and it's such an easy, fun experience to get a car. It's wonderful. You can see where the car is, you know how much time you have, there's a feedback system. Then people start to say, why can't my medical experience be that way? What if I need to find a doctor? Why do I have to wait in a lineup and not know where things are? So my expectation for service will be at the Uber level. Why does it take so long for me to get a visa or get my passport or get a payment? And governments are going to have to realize that's going to hit them very hard. And they often don't have the budgets. The employees don't have the freedom to be able to innovate. And this is where I think government leaders have to look exactly at these trends too and say, what does that mean for us? I know we won't go out of business, but how we do our business certainly must change. And that's why I think we need to find more mobility of people. If you work in business, you should then spend time in government. If you work in government, you should spend time in business. If you're in the social sector, and that's what I meant by this tri-sector athlete. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think there are differences, certainly, but I think the differences are things that we're all going to have to understand to be more effective leaders because we're dealing with an increasingly similar world.
That a company like McKinsey is uniquely positioned because during all these years, you gain so much experience and knowledge about best practices in the US and the developed world. But now you've got China or India or Africa, and these are really different markets. But do you think that, like as a consultant, you would give the advice to model after the US models, the big US institutions, adjusting for some things? Or do you think that the markets are so different, despite globalization, there is more need for more tailored and more different approaches depending on the market or the geography? Thank you.
It's a good question. I mean, firstly, I think that there are best practices, but they're certainly not just based on a US or Western model. As I said, a lot of the globalization best practices that we use with our clients in North America come from Asia, they come from Korea. Someone like Samsung is a very inspiring globalization transformation case for students of leadership and business in the US, right? And I said Lenovo about how we globalize. So first of all, I think where the examples come from are all over the world, and I think actually increasingly here. There's some also very good South American, Mexican food companies that are just world class in terms of how they operate. The second is you clearly do have to localize. I mean, there's different amounts of information that consumers have. There's different regulatory structures. You need to understand the sort of the government context in what's happening, and that's why it's global, local. I mean, you can't. You'd be really foolish, I think, just to take a best practice and think it could work in any. You have to understand the context of where it is. But I wouldn't go to the extreme to say it's so local that there isn't a best practice. I think there are effective ways to run a supply chain. I'm sorry, there are principles of how you do it. How you make it actually work, and you're going to hear that in the operations session that we have. has to be adjusted to the particular country or region in the context. So I think there's global best practices. They come from all over the world, increasingly from here, but they have to be contextualized to where they are. And that's why, for example, in McKinsey and others do this, we would, we've been in China since 1990. That's not, and the bulk of our consultants in China are Chinese, right? They're not, and they're part of a global system. The same in Germany. They're Germans, or they're Dutch, or they're Danish, but they're part of a global culture. And that's, organizations have different ways of doing that. Schneider, the French electricity and high tech, advanced analytics and artificial intelligence and these sort of things. They're a French company. They've now put their headquarters in Hong Kong, right? They're in 60 different countries with a very broad management team. There's very few now French leaders in the leadership team. That's an example of a global company. It's because they know they have to adapt to it. So that's at least how we would look at it.